The coffee in Evan Marshall's cup had gone cold an hour ago, but he didn't notice. His eyes remained fixed on the monitor in his cramped Seattle apartment, the glow casting shadows across his face that made him look older than his 31 years. It was 2 a.m. on a Wednesday in March 2025, and Evan had been staring at lines of encrypted code for 6 straight hours, his body vibrating with the particular energy that came from standing on the edge of discovery. His day job at Nexus Security was respectable, lucrative, and increasingly meaningless. He analyzed network vulnerabilities for Fortune 500 companies, implemented firewalls, prevented breaches, all the surface-level work of digital defense that protected people who never thought about their own safety online. But what really consumed Evan's consciousness was the void beneath the surface, the dark places where encryption didn't just protect privacy, but concealed atrocity. The deep web fascinated him not because he was morbidly curious, but because it represented a frontier that his professional expertise supposedly prepared him to understand. Except it didn't. Nothing he'd learned in his career had prepared him for what he was beginning to encounter. It had started innocuously enough. A client had mentioned discovering suspicious network activity that seemed to originate from hidden servers. Evan had investigated, following digital breadcrumbs through layers of anonymization, and had stumbled upon something that shouldn't exist, a database of files stored on servers distributed across multiple countries, protected by encryption so sophisticated that it took him 3 weeks to develop an algorithm to bypass it. When he finally succeeded, when he finally opened those files, he understood immediately that he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. The files contained documentation, photographs, video files with timestamps, and text descriptions that detailed activities so horrifying that Evan's first instinct had been to shut down his computer and call the FBI. But he hadn't, because embedded in the chaos of the data was a pattern, a logical structure, a taxonomy, an organization that suggested this wasn't random content captured from the depths of human depravity. This was curated. This was intentional. This was being maintained by someone who understood data architecture as well as Evan did. He'd spent the next 6 weeks developing protocols to isolate and analyze the files without corrupting the original data. He'd created shadow accounts on the dark web, establishing false identities, building a presence that would allow him to observe without being observed. He'd told nobody, not his colleagues at Nexus, not his parents in Portland, not even his therapist, whom he'd stopped seeing 2 months ago because the sessions felt pointless when measured against the enormity of what he was discovering. That's when he'd made contact with Maya Thompson. She'd appeared in an encrypted forum where he was collecting information about historical cults and extremist groups, research he needed to contextualize the patterns he was finding in the files. Her username was Prometheus, and her first message to him had been brutally direct. "You're looking at the wrong files. You need to be looking at what's connecting them." They'd communicated through encrypted channels for a week before agreeing to meet in person. Evan had been suspicious. For all he knew, he was about to walk into a trap, meet someone who was part of whatever network he'd been investigating. But the analytical part of him recognized that Maya's insights into the data patterns were too sophisticated, too precisely targeted to be anything other than genuine expertise. They'd met at a coffee shop in downtown Seattle, and Evan had immediately understood why Maya had chosen this profession. She had the look of someone who'd been awake for far too long, who'd seen things that had permanently altered her perspective on reality. She was 34, with prematurely graying hair pulled back in a careless bun, wearing a jacket that had probably been dark grey before it absorbed the particular exhaustion of someone living on the margins of conventional society. "I lost my sister to the deep web," she'd said without preamble, sliding into the chair across from him. "Not physically, she's still alive, technically, But psychologically, she's been destroyed by people who operate in the spaces you're exploring. I've spent 7 years trying to track them down, trying to understand how they operate, trying to build a case that institutions actually care about. And then I see someone like you starting down the same path, and I realize you're going to need help if you don't want to disappear into that rabbit hole completely. Evan had listened, and he'd heard something in Maya's voice that resonated with his own experience, the particular desperation of someone who'd seen too much and couldn't unsee it, who'd been changed by knowledge in ways that couldn't be reversed through therapy or distance or deliberate ignorance. "Show me what you've found," Maya had said, "and then we'll talk about what we do next." That conversation had been 3 weeks ago. Now, sitting alone in his apartment at 2 a.m., Evan realized that his entire life had fundamentally shifted. He was no longer a cybersecurity analyst with a comfortable salary and a predictable future. He was someone on the edge of an abyss, looking into darkness that looked back, and he was no longer entirely sure he wanted to step away from it. The safe house was located in a renovated industrial building in Portland, Oregon. A space that Maya had secured through contacts that Evan had decided not to ask about. The walls were covered with the same organizational system that Evan had seen in his own apartment. Photographs, documents, maps, timeline threads connecting seemingly disparate incidents. But what struck Evan most forcefully was the evidence that Maya had been doing this work alone for years. The depth of her research, the sophistication of her data analysis, the breadth of her institutional knowledge about how the deep web actually functioned, these things suggested a level of obsession that matched his own. "The files you found," Maya said, standing before a timeline that stretched across 15 feet of wall space. "They're part of something larger than random criminal activity. There's a structure, there's intention. There's what I call the infrastructure of suffering, a network of individuals, groups, and organizations that have created a parallel economy where human exploitation is the commodity being traded." She pointed to a cluster of photographs. "These are people connected to extremist communities scattered across the Pacific Northwest, the Midwest, and parts of the Deep South. They maintain communication through encrypted channels that shift protocols every 72 hours. They trade information, they share resources, they participate in activities that range from financial fraud to," she paused, her jaw tightening, "to human trafficking and worse." Evan studied the faces. They looked normal. That was what disturbed him most. Not because he'd expected monsters to look like monsters, his understanding of human behavior was more sophisticated than that, but because seeing normalcy attached to such darkness made the disconnect feel uniquely disorienting. "My sister was recruited into one of these communities," Maya continued quietly. "She was vulnerable, going through a divorce, financially desperate, searching for community. Someone on social media identified these vulnerabilities with surgical precision and began cultivating a relationship. Within 6 months, she was part of a closed group that eventually involved her in activities she didn't initially understand were criminal. By the time she realized what was happening, she'd already compromised herself sufficiently that she couldn't escape without legal consequences." "Where is she now?" Evan asked. "Living in a trailer park outside Spokane, working at a gas station, taking medication for severe anxiety disorder that developed after she finally managed to extract herself from the group. She won't talk to me about what actually happened, won't report anything to authorities. Won't even acknowledge that the group exists. That's the real power of these networks, Evan. They don't just exploit people physically or financially. They compromise them so completely that escape becomes psychologically impossible." Over the following weeks, Evan and Maya worked methodically through the data. They cross-referenced files with historical cult activity, with documented cases of human trafficking, with financial records of shell corporations and cryptocurrency transactions. Slowly, a picture emerged of something far more sophisticated than random predators operating on the dark web. What they were looking at was an organized system, not a traditional hierarchy, but a distributed network of nodes that maintained connectivity through shared ideology, mutual participation in criminal activity, and carefully maintained anonymity. The breakthrough came when Maya identified a pattern in the timestamps of video uploads. They clustered around specific dates, always either solstices, equinoxes, or dates that corresponded to historical cult events. And embedded in the metadata of each file was a coordinate, latitude and longitude markers that, when plotted on a map, formed a pattern across the United States. The markers congregated in areas known for isolated communities, for extremist populations, for places where federal authority was minimal and local institutions were either complicit or overwhelmed. "They're not just operating in the digital space," Maya said, her voice shaking slightly. "They're physical communities, real people in real locations. And they're using the deep web to maintain communication, to coordinate activity, to share resources. The files you found, they're evidence of operations happening right now across multiple states, involving hundreds of participants." But it was during the fourth week of their investigation that Evan experienced something that fundamentally altered his understanding of what they were pursuing. He'd been analyzing a particularly disturbing file, one that appeared to be a live stream recording of some kind of ceremony, when he noticed something embedded in the visual corruption that appeared at the edges of the frame. A symbol, a pattern, something that repeated across 17 different files despite the apparent randomness of the recorded content. When he showed it to Maya, her reaction was visceral. She went pale. Her hands trembled. For the first time since Evan had known her, her careful professional composure completely fractured. "That symbol," she whispered, "appears in videos my sister described to me. Videos she was forced to watch as part of her integration into the group. I never saw them, thank God, but she described the symbol in nightmares. She said it meant something about rebirth through suffering, about understanding that pain was transformative, about accepting that some people were meant to carry darkness so that others could live in light." Evan felt something cold settle into his chest. The symbol was appearing across multiple independent communities, separated by geography, by apparent ideology, by every institutional analysis that suggested they shouldn't be connected. And yet they were connected, bound together by something deeper than organizational structure, by something almost philosophical in nature. "We need to go to the authorities," Evan said. "We have evidence of coordinated criminal activity. We have documentation of live criminal events. We have nothing that will convince anyone to act," Maya interrupted. "I've tried this before, Evan. I've presented evidence to the FBI, to state law enforcement, to federal prosecutors. They either don't believe the data, don't understand the significance, or actively suppress the investigation, because acknowledging what we're looking at would require acknowledging systemic failures in how they monitor extremist activity. The institutional response to this kind of revelation is not action, it's denial and suppression." "Then what do we do?" Evan asked. Maya looked at him with an expression that contained both hope and something approaching despair. "We keep digging. We find proof so irrefutable, so extensive, so documented that ignoring it becomes impossible. We find the people behind this. And we make sure that what happened to my sister, what's being done to hundreds of other victims right now, becomes impossible to ignore or rationalize away." Evan understood in that moment that he'd passed a point of no return. He could have stopped there, could have reported what he'd found to authorities, could have resumed his normal life, but the patterns were calling to him now in a way that transcended rational professional curiosity. He was beginning to understand something about human darkness that no classroom or professional training could have taught him, that evil operated according to its own logic, its own aesthetic principles, its own internal coherence. And understanding that logic he was discovering created a kind of psychological dependency that made walking away feel like abandonment. 6 months into their investigation, Evan had transformed completely. He'd taken a leave of absence from Nexus Security, citing personal reasons that were technically true, if massively incomplete. He'd moved into the Portland safe house permanently, converting the entire second floor into a workspace that mirrored the organization of the data they were analyzing. He barely slept. He'd lost 18 pounds. His apartment in Seattle sat empty, his lease eventually terminated by automated payment failures. The only part of his previous life that remained intact was a carefully maintained facade, a dormant social media presence, occasional emails to concerned friends and family, asserting that he was fine and just needed time to work through some things. Maya had noticed the transformation, and she'd warned him about it multiple times. "You're disappearing into the work," she'd said just last week. "I can see it happening. Your eyes have that particular hollowness that comes from spending too much time in dark places. You need to step back. You need to remember that there's a world outside of this." But Evan couldn't step back. The patterns had revealed themselves too completely. The network they were mapping was far larger than either of them had initially understood. It wasn't just a collection of extremist communities operating independently. It was a deliberately constructed system of information exchange, resource sharing, and coordinated activity that seemed designed to remain invisible to external scrutiny while maintaining extraordinary internal sophistication. What made the architecture of this darkness particularly chilling was its apparent rationality. These weren't irrational individuals gathered around charismatic cult leaders. They were often educated, sometimes professionally accomplished, individuals who participated in conventional society while maintaining parallel identities and activities in the hidden web. Some were therapists, teachers, law enforcement officers. Some were financial professionals. Some worked in government agencies that were theoretically designed to prevent exactly this kind of activity. Evan had spent 3 weeks analyzing a particular cluster of files that appeared to document financial transactions. The amounts were staggering. Millions of dollars moving through cryptocurrency exchanges, then converting into conventional currency through a series of shell corporations and seemingly legitimate business ventures. He'd traced the money backward, following the pattern of transactions until they led to something that made his breath catch. The transactions originated from accounts he could trace to federal law enforcement databases, which meant either the accounts had been compromised or people within federal institutions were directly funding the network they were investigating. He'd brought this discovery to Maya at 3 a.m., unable to wait until morning, unable to contain the shock of understanding that the corruption ran deeper than either of them had anticipated. "This is what I've been saying," Maya had replied, her voice flat with a particular exhaustion that came from having her worst suspicions confirmed. "This isn't a fringe activity. This is embedded in institutional structures. This is being protected by the same organizations that are supposed to prevent it." "That's impossible," Evan had said, though even as the words left his mouth, he understood their falsity. Nothing was impossible. Everything was possible. Human institutions were capable of astonishing hypocrisy and complicity. The turning point came in the 7th month, when they discovered something that fundamentally shifted their understanding of what they were pursuing. Embedded in a video file, one that appeared to be a training session for new members of one of the peripheral communities, was a reference to something called Project Containment. The speaker, whose face was obscured, but whose voice suggested education and authority, described containment as the infrastructure that allows us to operate freely while preventing external discovery. He described it as a system of information management that ensures the right people in the right institutions understand exactly what we're doing and choose, through various incentives and disincentives, to allow our operation to continue. Evan had spent 3 weeks analyzing that single video file, extracting metadata, cross-referencing voice patterns, attempting to identify the speaker. He'd eventually determined that the voice belonged to someone who'd held a mid-level position in the FBI's Seattle field office before retiring 4 years earlier. The man was now living in a house in rural Washington, working as a consultant for a private security firm that, upon investigation, appeared to be primarily staffed by former law enforcement and military personnel. "We found someone," Evan told Maya, showing her the documentation he'd compiled. "Someone who connects federal institutions to the network. Someone who might be able to explain how this operates at the institutional level." Maya studied the materials with an expression that cycled through recognition, fear, and something approaching determination. This man, if we approach him, if we confront him, we're committing to a path that has no safe exit. You understand that, right? Once we move from observation to confrontation, we're no longer researchers. We're threats to a system that has already demonstrated its capacity to protect itself through whatever means necessary. "I understand," Evan said. And he did. He'd understood for months, possibly since the beginning, that pursuing this knowledge would eventually require action that carried real danger. But the patterns were too coherent, the evidence too extensive, the injustice too systemic to abandon. "Then we need to take precautions," Maya said. She walked to a locked cabinet in the corner of the room and withdrew a laptop that Evan had never seen before. "I've been preparing for this moment for 7 years. I have documentation secured in multiple locations. I have contacts in journalist networks, in academic institutions, in international law enforcement agencies. If something happens to either of us, the information gets released. It's our insurance policy and our amplification mechanism." Evan spent the next week learning the protocols that Maya had developed. The dead man switches, the secured communications, the network of individuals who'd agreed to receive and distribute the documentation if certain conditions were met. It was simultaneously reassuring and terrifying, creating the sense that they were no longer operating as two individuals pursuing a mystery, but as nodes in their own network, participants in their own organized system of information exchange and protection. The plan was to approach the former FBI agent, to confront him with evidence, to attempt to turn him into a cooperating witness. It was dangerous, probably futile, certainly risky in ways they couldn't fully anticipate. But it was also the only path forward that maintained the possibility of institutional accountability. They were preparing for the confrontation when Evan received an email from an unknown address. It contained a single line: "You've found something you shouldn't have. There's still time to stop looking. Please consider taking it." The email was untraceable, but it made something clear to both Evan and Maya. They'd been discovered. Their investigation, which they'd believed was conducted with military-grade operational security, had become visible to the very people they were investigating. The question that suddenly dominated their consciousness wasn't what they'd find when they confronted the former FBI agent. It was whether they'd survive the confrontation at all. The drive to the house in rural Washington took 5 hours through rain that fell with the particular intensity of early autumn on the Pacific Northwest. Evan drove, while Maya reviewed documentation on her encrypted tablet, occasionally reading passages aloud as if verbalizing the information somehow made it more manageable. Neither of them spoke about what would happen if the confrontation went wrong, if the former agent responded with violence instead of negotiation, if their appearance at his door triggered some protective protocol that they hadn't anticipated. The house was isolated, set back from the road by a quarter-mile, surrounded by dense forest, deliberately positioned to prevent easy approach or observation. Evan parked the car at the end of the driveway and sat for several minutes, hands on the steering wheel, breathing steadily through the panic that was trying to override his decision-making. "If this goes wrong," Maya said quietly, "if he responds with anything other than cooperation, we leave immediately and trigger the dead man's switch. We let the information we've compiled speak for itself." "And if it goes right?" Evan asked. "Then maybe," Maya replied, "we finally get someone inside the system willing to tell the truth about what they've done and why." The former agent's name was David Morrison, and when he opened the door, he looked exactly like what he was. A man in his 60s who'd spent 30 years in law enforcement and was now living a deliberately modest life, separated from the institutions that had defined his professional identity. He didn't seem surprised to see them. If anything, his expression suggested something closer to resignation. "I wondered when you'd come," he said, stepping aside to allow them entry into a living room that was meticulously organized and utterly devoid of personal warmth. "I've been monitoring your investigation since you started accessing the files. I allowed it to continue because I thought you might reach conclusions on your own, but now you're here, which means you've moved from observation to confrontation, and that changes what I can tell you." Over the next 6 hours, David Morrison revealed a truth that was far more complex and more damning than either Evan or Maya had anticipated. Project Containment wasn't some clandestine conspiracy to enable criminal activity. It was something more cynical and more systematic. It was institutional acknowledgement that the deep web had created a parallel society that was impossible to fully monitor or control, and that the best approach was managed coexistence rather than attempted suppression. "We realized about 20 years ago," Morrison explained, "that trying to eliminate these networks was futile. They were distributed, encrypted, constantly evolving. The resources required to actually shut them down would have been impossible to allocate. So instead, we chose a different approach. We identified key nodes in the network. We cultivated relationships with individuals in positions of influence, and we created what you might call a harm reduction strategy. We couldn't eliminate the activity, but we could monitor it. We could prevent the most egregious behaviors, and we could ensure that what remained was contained and manageable." "You're describing institutional complicity in criminal activity," Evan said, his voice carefully controlled despite the rage moving through him. "I'm describing institutional realism," Morrison replied. "Look, I'm not proud of the choices I made, but at a certain point in your career, you realize that the world doesn't work the way you were trained to believe it works. Darkness exists. It's always going to exist. The question is whether you acknowledge that and attempt to manage it, or whether you maintain a comfortable fiction about your ability to eliminate it and let it grow completely uncontrolled." Maya stood up abruptly. "My sister was part of one of those manageable communities. She was trafficked, exploited, and traumatized. And your harm reduction strategy apparently included allowing all of that to happen as long as it remained within acceptable parameters." "I'm sorry about your sister," Morrison said, and there was something in his tone that suggested genuine remorse. "I've encountered thousands of people harmed by these networks. The tragedy is that no matter what choices we made, institutional level, the suffering would have happened. The network was going to exist. People were going to be exploited. The only question was whether we tried to manage that exploitation or abandoned the entire effort." "You chose to become complicit," Evan said. "We chose," Morrison corrected, "to operate within the constraints of reality, which is something you're going to have to decide how to handle with the information you've gathered." The revelation had been both more and less than they'd expected. There was no single conspiracy, no clear command structure, no simple villain to identify and apprehend. What existed instead was institutional acceptance of systemic darkness as an inevitable cost of modern digital society. And the question Morrison was implicitly posing was whether exposure of that reality would actually change anything, or simply create outrage that institutions would eventually absorb and normalize. Evan and Maya left the house 3 hours before dawn, driving in silence back toward Portland. Neither of them spoke about what they'd learned, about the impossible choice Morrison had placed before them: maintain the information and attempt to force institutional change through public exposure, or accept that some darkness was simply too fundamental to the functioning of modern society to truly eliminate. The decision, when it came, wasn't dramatic. It emerged over coffee at their safe house, in the quiet conversation that followed a week of separate processing and reflection. "We release it," Maya said finally. "All of it. Every piece of evidence we've gathered, every institutional connection we've identified, every piece of documentation about what Project Containment actually represents. We release it to journalists, to international law enforcement, to organizations that actually have interest in accountability. We accept that institutional change might be impossible, but we make it impossible to ignore. That will destroy our lives," Evan said. "The moment this becomes public, we'll have federal agencies investigating us, questioning whether we obtained information illegally, possibly charging us with crimes." "Yes," Maya agreed. "That's the cost of deciding that some truths are important enough to justify that consequence." They spent the next month preparing the documentation for release. They worked with journalists at 3 different major news organizations. They provided copies to international police agencies. They ensured that the information was distributed in ways that made it impossible for any single institution to suppress it completely. And then they waited. The story broke on a Tuesday morning in late November 2025. The headlines were significant, the implications enormous. Federal institutions maintained covert relationships with deep web networks, documents suggest. Institutional investigations were immediately launched. Morrison was arrested. Questions were raised in Congress. A brief period of genuine scandal emerged in the media landscape, and then, gradually, it faded. The story was absorbed into the general noise of institutional dysfunction. Morrison was convicted of corruption and sentenced to 5 years in prison, a sentence that felt simultaneously too harsh and meaninglessly inadequate. Attempts at institutional reform were proposed, debated, and eventually shelved as resources were allocated to other priorities. Evan and Maya were prosecuted for unauthorized access to federal databases, a charge that was eventually plea-bargained down to probation and significant fines. They became minor figures in a larger scandal, their names appearing in footnotes and background sections rather than in the primary narrative of the story they'd originated. In the end, what they'd discovered was something far more disturbing than any individual crime or criminal network. They'd discovered that the machinery of modern civilization was incapable of meaningful response to systemic darkness, that institutions preferred managed coexistence with evil to the disruption that genuine accountability would create. Evan never returned to cybersecurity work. He spent the next year rebuilding his life in Portland, taking a job at a non-profit organization that worked with trafficking survivors. The work was emotionally difficult, but it offered something that his previous career never had: direct connection to the human impact of the systems he'd been analyzing. Maya eventually reconnected with her sister. The relationship remained fractured, but it existed. Her sister eventually agreed to participate in support groups for trafficking survivors, and through that participation began the slow process of processing what had been done to her and how the systems that supposedly protected people had instead enabled her exploitation. Neither of them ever returned to deep web investigation. They'd found what they'd been looking for, and they'd learned that finding it didn't bring resolution, only the hard, ongoing work of living with knowledge that couldn't be unknotted or forgotten. Months after the story had faded from public consciousness, Evan sat in his Portland apartment, a modest place carefully selected to be undistinguished and unremarkable, and thought about something Morrison had said during their confrontation. The real tragedy isn't that darkness exists. The real tragedy is that we've created systems so large and so complex that individuals within those systems can rationalize nearly any behavior as the inevitable cost of maintaining institutional continuity. Evan understood now that this was the deepest secret of the deep web. It wasn't some hidden technological frontier where unprecedented darkness lurked. It was simply a manifestation of darkness that had always been present in human institutions, now made visible through digital architecture, now impossible to deny or ignore, yet simultaneously impossible to meaningfully address through institutional change. The work continued. Survivors continued to emerge from exploitative networks. Federal agencies continued to maintain their complicated relationships with criminal communities. New technologies continued to create new spaces where darkness could operate, and individuals like Evan and Maya continued to search for truth, knowing that finding it wouldn't save anyone, but that the search itself was the only form of resistance available to those who couldn't accept managed evil as inevitable. Some secrets, Evan realized, couldn't be unseen once discovered. They could only be carried forward, transformed into action, woven into ongoing resistance against systems that preferred darkness to change.